Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Coastal Resilience Network webinar. My name is Dan Hosfeld. I'm the coordinator for the Coastal Resilience Network and the Climate Ready Sea Grant Fellow at the State Coastal Conservancy. Today, our topic, Set the Compass for Coastal Resilience, Aligning Local Planning Efforts to Sail Towards Adaptation. We're going to go over a couple quick logistics, and then I'll hand it off to our speakers today. So first, we'd ask that if you're joining us now, it'd be great if you could introduce yourselves to us. Just let us know your name and affiliation. You can put that in a chat box or the questions box. Feel free to ask questions at any time throughout. You can use the questions box to ask those questions. Participants are muted automatically, so that's the best way to reach us. And since we have a panel today, it'd be great if you could direct your questions to a particular person or let us know if it's okay to ask the broader group. And I'll also just note quickly that the webinar is recorded, so you'll have a recording afterwards as well as a copy of these slides sent out after the webinar today. Okay, so today we're going to hear from a whole group of people in order of appearance. We have Becky Lunde from the NOAA Office of Coastal Management, Juliette Finzi Hart from USGS, Leeanne Singleton, City of Hermosa Beach, Nuin-Tara at the OPR, Kelsey Ducklow at California Coastal Commission, Victoria LaMar-Haas at the Office of Emergency Services, and Mary Small from the State Coastal Conservancy. So that's all I've got. I'm going to pass it over to Becky Lunde.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. I'm Becky Lunde with the Office for Coastal Management, and today we're going to explore how and why to align local planning documents for coastal hazard resilience. This webinar is going to run a little bit differently, perhaps from the norm. We have such a big panel, and we have additional experts waiting in the wings, but we're not going to deliver 7 presentations to you. Instead, we're going to organize ourselves based on 4 trivia questions. So we will be polling questions for you all to put your thinking caps on throughout the webinar, and then we'll have select panelists reflect and give their perspectives on each of those questions. Again, we would like to try to have discussion throughout, so pop those questions in the chat box. And we're trying to save time at the end for us to have further discussion and Q&A, so we'll see how that goes. First, before we dig into that, let's take a quick moment to introduce some context, some background. What do we mean when we say plan alignment, and why are we talking about it? So go ahead, new slide, thanks. So the diversity of affiliations of the folks on this panel is reflective of the wide range of state and federal agencies that a few years ago began having conversations about the complexities of planning for hazard resilience. Not all of these agencies historically would interact with one another, but since that time, we've developed really close staff level relationships. And we came together when local communities began, for various reasons, to consider climate change impacts when developing and updating their local plans. Each agency here has some role or interest in these local plans. The actions that a community can take to become more resilient to natural hazards include both climate change adaptation strategies and hazard mitigation actions. And sometimes these are one and the same. It's just semantics of which plan and which agency you're working with and on. There are multiple planning documents that influence or direct which actions and policies may be included, and different government departments develop the plans and oversee the approval processes. So like at the state and federal level, most of the time these different local departments don't interact. So we have this messy field here, right? The ideal state of planning in the future is all boats or plans navigating in the same direction toward a community's resilience, and hence we use this compass metaphor. Recognizing that many local communities are struggling with incorporating climate change into various local plans, and recognizing the value of coordination and an alignment of plans, the state and federal partners on that list created the Coastal Plan Alignment Flipbook, or Compass, quote unquote. And its purpose is to help facilitate and make the case for alignment of plans. And it can be used as a discussion starter, a communication tool, a quick start guide. And in it, we focus on coastal hazards of sea level rise and flooding specifically in 4 particular local plans. And we're going to go over those plans in a moment. But the concepts can be applied to other hazards and to other plans that involve hazard mitigation and adaptation actions. So the bottom line is to help local government staff begin to think about, when you're updating a plan, what can you do differently to connect with other plans that also include those kinds of adaptation and mitigation actions. So the Compass shares some big ideas that support good resilience planning. There's a crosswalk section that provides overarching actions that apply across all plans. And there are tricky places, tricky spots to be aware of, so that plans aren't operating at cross purposes or conflicting with each other or some other potential hurdles. And it also highlights specific details for each of the 4 plans, including who to add to the planning team to facilitate cross-plan coordination. So at this point, let's turn to Juliette. She's going to spend a moment giving us an overview of the 4 plans so that we're all on the same page, and then we're going to dive into our trivia. So over to you, Juliette.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is not meant to be a deep dive into these plans. We're hoping that you have at least some level of familiarity with them. And if you don't, that's okay, because we have people that you can then connect with after. But just so we all sort of have the same sense of which plans and what they do as we go through the trivia questions, we wanted to give a little overview. So in the Compass, we have these 4 plans that we focus on specifically. So if you go to the next slide, please. The first one that we talk about is what most communities are doing now, which is the Climate Adaptation Plan. And we thought it would be helpful to sort of summarize these plans in 6 words each. So for the Climate Adaptation Plan, the 6 words that we came up with to describe it are community adaptation objectives with regional context. So as many of you know who are doing adaptation plans, there's not necessarily a set policy or way to do these. There's a lot of variability in how they're done, but generally they involve an evaluation and prioritization of actions or strategies to prepare for and respond to climate change impacts. The lead agency really varies, so through whether you're doing it at the city or the county level. Similarly, the approval agency, if there even is one, will vary from local jurisdictions to city councils to county commissioners, board of supervisors, et cetera. So there is no set necessarily way of doing these, but there's a lot of really good guidance that's been provided by the state throughout the years by different agencies, et cetera. And so a lot of those are listed on the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which you'll hear us refer to a number of times throughout this webinar. We identify some of the best practices, which is, this is a place where you can set your community goals. You can think about the implementation and funding plans in here, and really thinking at this multi-sectoral and even regional scale when you're doing this work. Go to the next slide. The next plan that we highlight in here are the local hazard mitigation plans. So the 6 words for those would be reduce natural and human-caused disaster impacts. So these local hazard mitigation plans are done at the local scale, as implied by its title, but they're the same across the country. They tend to, their focus is to identify risks, vulnerabilities, and long-term strategies for protecting people, property, and the environment. They aren't required, but in order to access FEMA-approved FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance funding, a jurisdiction must have a FEMA-approved local hazard mitigation plan. So there are lots of incentives and reasons to think about developing one of these so that you can access these funds. Its development is typically led by city or county or emergency services, a fire department, or planning department, but that again varies by place to place. And I failed to note this on the previous slide, but at the bottom right, you'll all get the copy of this presentation afterwards, and it's recorded, but you'll see one of the point people that we have on our team that you can reach out to for more information. So in this case, we have Victoria LaMar-Haas from Cal OES, who you'll be hearing from in a little bit. The required components are the vulnerability assessment, identifying strategies, and prioritize projects. And then there are a couple of really important best practices specifically for California, which is the inclusion of environmental justice and equity, and also thinking about climate adaptation is encouraged. The next plan that we focus on in the Compass is if you go to the next slide, is the general plan. So many of you who are involved in developing your general plan know that, again, here there's been a lot of movement at the state level to try to connect the general plan, and specifically the safety element, to the climate adaptation work that most communities are doing. So our 6 words here for the general plan are comprehensive plan implementing a community vision. So for California and others, if you come from a different state, you might know it as a comp plan, but essentially the general plan is this comprehensive plan outlining a vision for future growth. It tends to be developed by the county or city planning departments, and then is approved at the county level, the Board of Supervisors, or at the city level by the City Council. Again, the required elements are adaptation and resilience in the safety element, incorporation of vulnerability assessment, and consideration of environmental justice concerns and strategies. And some of the best practices that we highlight are that use long-term planning horizon to account for the climate impacts. Generally speaking, general plans are looking a certain amount of time out into the future, but we've been trying to think about how communities can use the general plan to have even further longer-term planning. And then the final plan that we talk about, if you go to the next slide, is the local coastal program. This is implemented by the California Coastal Commission. The 6 words to describe the LCP are regulate safe coastal development, protect resources. So in California, local coastal programs are land use and implementation plans that carry out the Coastal Act at the local level and provide the legal standard for new and existing development and coastal resource protection. They're usually developed by the city or county planning departments and are approved by the California Coastal Commission, which is part of California's Coastal Zone Management Program. So the required elements, again, most communities at this point have gotten somewhere down the path of updating their local coastal programs, but really the focus is on minimizing risk and maximizing coastal resource protection. There's a requirement for public outreach, and as we'll talk about further down in the webinar, these thinking about phased adaptation and address changing conditions. And the point of contact there is Kelsey, and neglected to mention the other 2 points of contact, but these are the folks that you can turn to for more information. So that is meant to just give you a highlight and overview of these different plans, and then now we're gonna dig in and start having some trivia. So I think that wraps me up.
Thank you, Juliette. And so we're gonna open our first poll question. Let's do some trivia. So the first question is, how can resources be leveraged across multiple planning processes? And I won't read out the answers, but I will give you a moment of silence to think about your response. Okay, we've got some answers coming in here. Almost all of you have voted. We're getting there. Punch in your answer. I don't want to do the big reveal too soon. Okay, so the answer is all of the above. So even if you selected A, B, C, or D, you're still right. The answer is E, all of the above. And so what we're going to do is turn to Leeanne with the City of Hermosa Beach to get us started with some thoughts on this.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So I'm going to talk just briefly from the local perspective on how do we leverage some of our resources here across multiple planning processes. For those of you that aren't familiar, the City of Hermosa Beach, we are a 20,000 resident town here in LA County, just south of Santa Monica. And we decided a couple years back that we were going to kind of go big or go home in updating all of our plans. including all four that were kind of introduced here at the beginning of this. So back in 2012, we started with the process of updating and integrating both our general plan and our local coastal program. About half of our city is located within the coastal zone, so it made sense for us to really look at kind of the crossover between those. And just kind of while we were in that process, general plan processes can take anywhere from 2 or 3 years up to, I've heard cities, counties taking 10 years on their general plan updates. It took us about 4, but during that process, we also recognized that it was time to update our local hazard mitigation plan, which is supposed to be updated every 5 years. So with our small team, we undertook the effort on an idea that we can leverage resources and funding from state and federal agencies to incorporate both resilience studies and policies into multiple documents. And we did that through a series of 3 grants that we were able to kind of patch together for different levels of studies. So we received a grant from the Strategic Growth Council here in California to assist with kind of the general plan policy component and a lot of our community engagement, as well as the vulnerability study for our social vulnerability to sea level rise. We followed that with a grant from the California Coastal Commission to work on the specific coastal policies. And when it came time to update our hazard mitigation plan, we were able to secure funding from FEMA to support that. And the key with a lot of that, and the selling point for a lot of these agencies, was that we were able to leverage some of the technical studies, both our infrastructure and social vulnerability assessments for sea level rise, do those once, and then let the funding that they had available support kind of the policy and plan development. For our city, we're a pretty small team. And so to take on updating multiple plans all at the same time was a little bit of an all hands on deck approach for us. It included a blend of both our policy and technical experts, both planners, environmental analysts, our building department. Hazard mitigation plans are often prepared through fire departments or emergency managers. So we worked very closely with our emergency manager on that, as well as our engineers. So it was a big investment of time for our team. It's worked very well in kind of building the base and made collaboration toward not only the plan development and adoption, but also implementation much easier to coordinate for our team in the long term.
Thank you, Leeanne. Should we turn over to Nuin-Tara?
Great. That was a perfect segue into what I wanted to cover for this. So hello, everyone. This is Nuin-Tara from the Office of Planning and Research. Really excited to be here today and to join this wonderful panel here. I think I just want to really reiterate a lot of what Leeanne highlighted here in her quick overview, in that, you know, through the alignment process, while the funding, there are obviously funding limitations, and we definitely recognize that, you know, the approach of having to piece together multiple different funding streams, as she mentioned, you know, needing to patching together 3 different grants to support this effort, that there still is tremendous opportunity in aligning the vulnerability assessments across these different plans, and that really being able to leverage these, a single assessment, or as Leeanne highlighted, being able to kind of piece off different portions of an assessment for specific plans, but having it be done in a comprehensive way, really provides a couple of key opportunities that I wanted to highlight. One is that it really helps to advance some of the cross-sector alignment and perspective that is critically needed as part of an adaptation planning and resilience, building community resilience. And so bringing together these different plans through a single vulnerability assessment or related assessment is a great way to bring that cross-sector perspective together. It also, I think, provides a great opportunity to ensure that vulnerability assessments are really grounded in an equity perspective that recognizes different communities and people in a community are experiencing those vulnerabilities to climate change, in different ways, and that it's due to some of the underlying kind of structural inequities or conditions within communities, and that by leveraging one vulnerability assessment or related series of studies that make up an assessment, you can really start to piece together and understand the systems that are interacting within a community. And as Leeanne highlighted, I think there's really great opportunity to make sure that these through plan alignment, especially thinking about vulnerability assessments, to make sure that you're really bringing in an assessment of the built infrastructure with the natural resources or systems within a community, as well as the kind of socioeconomic and social dimensions within a community. So I think, just to wrap up here, by approaching this plan alignment process in really thinking about the role of vulnerability assessments, you can really help to get at some of these fundamental cross-sectoral approaches that are needed in bringing these plans together. So with that, I'll hand it over.
Thanks, Nuin-Tara. And before we go to question 2, let's check in really quickly. Juliette, do you see any questions in the chat box yet?
I don't think so.
I see we have a questions box too. I'm sorry, I didn't realize we had 2 different. There's a questions box.
And I don't think I'm seeing anything, so I don't know if you guys are seeing something different than I am, but I don't see any.
Okay. Thank you. So let's move on to trivia question number 2. We're pulling up the poll now. Can benefits be gained from integrating the same risk reduction strategies in multiple local plans? I'll give you a moment. Okay, we're just over half of you voted. We're getting up there. One more second. Put in your final response. Okay. Oh, this is great. On the administrator end, we can see the % of you that have voted, which is how we know when to cut you off. Okay, so interestingly, some of you thought the answer could be maybe, but only due to cross-sector buy-in from relationships built during the process. So you're cluing into something that we're talking about here, that the importance of the relationships is fundamental. But actually the answer here is yes. One benefit is avoiding contradicting strategies. So I'm going to turn over to Kelsey to kick this one off.
Hi, everyone. This is Kelsey from the Coastal Commission. Thanks for being here. And I just want to say that absolutely there are benefits from integrating resilient strategies across all of these different plans. Just from a practical standpoint, adaptation strategies or these kind of risk reduction strategies that are in local planning documents can also be used as mitigation actions in an LHMP. So at a minimum, it makes sense to cross-reference these kinds of plans. But a major benefit to actually really truly integrating these strategies throughout these plans is making sure there aren't contradictory strategies in each of them. And so one common place for potential conflicts would be mitigation actions in an LHMP that call for armoring. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the Coastal Act has very stringent policies related to armoring because of its impacts to beaches and natural resources. So mitigation actions that are calling for protecting structures in place, which is a fairly common engineering strategy for reducing risk, might not actually be approvable. They probably potentially wouldn't get permits from either us or a local government. And a similar case would be elevating structures. So areas that have height limits for scenic views would potentially have conflicts with any strategies related to elevating above flood level. This isn't to say that either of those kinds of strategies are wrong or bad. It's just that one thing we want to think about as we're developing all these different plans is how it all fits together. So by thinking about LCP and general plan policies and requirements when developing an LHMP and thinking about those kinds of mitigation actions or risk reduction strategies, these kind of conflicts can actually be avoided before it becomes a problem. Separately, I wanted to note how helpful a standalone adaptation plan can be. This type of document can be an important tool for housing a community's overall vision and goals, and then guiding the short and long-term actions that are needed to get there. And in this way, when plans are updated or developed, they can refer back to that adaptation plan to ensure actions within individual plans are consistent with the broader goals and objectives. And so one example of this is that LCP policies can ensure that new development actions or actions for existing development are taken with resilience in mind, and they can also lay the policy groundwork to ensure that individual adaptation projects that are developed over time will be able to be permitted. And then separately, an LHMP could then consider those types of adaptation projects as well, integrate those within the LHMP as mitigation actions, and then that would qualify them for funding opportunities. So you start to see how all of these can fit together, and by actually, leveraging each other and building off of each other, they're really consistent all across all different kinds of planning departments and within a city. One other thing to note is that adaptation plans can be a place where a community can reach beyond its own boundaries. LCPs are fairly specific to an individual jurisdiction, but when you start to think about these kinds of hazards, they're obviously not going to stop at a jurisdiction's borders. And so an adaptation plan can reach beyond borders and think about how an action that are taken up or down coast are going to affect your own jurisdiction. And so, these can lead to, again, addressing and avoiding conflicts between neighboring jurisdictions as well. I think turning it over then to Victoria to talk a little bit more about those kinds of LHMP connections.
Hi, this is Victoria LaMar-Haas from California Office of Emergency Services, and I work in the Mitigation Planning Department. This definitely is beneficial for us to integrate plans as much as we can. It helps our community work smarter and not harder, but it also ensures that our communities are building resilience through safer, stronger, and smarter plans. I also will say within the local hazard mitigation required elements, a jurisdiction must show us what plans and policies that they have access to help create the local hazard mitigation plan. And then on the flip side, they also must demonstrate to us what they're going to use that local hazard mitigation plan to help inform as far as other planning documents in their community. We have some pretty strict guidelines in creating our risk assessment. So a lot of times communities will create their local hazard mitigation plan first and then take that risk assessment and apply it to other plans, such as adaptation plans and our emergency action plans or emergency operation plans. We do have an interesting twist with our planning. As Kelsey mentioned, a lot of times our local emergency managers are in charge of our plans. They are not planners. So the more successful plans that we see integrating with the local hazard mitigation plans ensure that they have their planning department included on their team. And then that helps that community identify legislative requirements, ensuring that climate change is included in the local hazard mitigation plan, as well as environmental justice regulations. That we in California have the fortune to have some legislative requirements backing those up. The integration of these plans also helps us identify potential funding sources, which is very important. So we have several funding sources to help implement mitigation actions in California, and if one is not funded through a FEMA program, there may be another program that would help through, say, our Department of Water Resources. So the one thing I can absolutely hit home here is the relationships and building these plans are probably the most important thing. Who gets on the planning teams to help put it together. And then that helps you to create that network of bringing other groups together that are doing all of these different plans.
Thank you, Victoria. While Dan pulls up to see if we have questions at this point. I actually have a question, and I think it will be directed to Jesse Carpentier, who's with FEMA Region 9 on the phone. Sorry to put you on the spot, Jesse. But Victoria, you and Megan may also know the answer to this. You mentioned that in local hazard mitigation plans, communities must show what they're going to use the LHMP for, how they're going to connect it to other plans in the community. And I'm wondering, we do have folks on the phone that are not from California. So is that requirement specific to California, or is that something that's required in all states for their LHMPs?
Hi, this is Megan. I can go ahead and answer from a state plan perspective. So
Okay.
I'm responsible at CalOES for leading the coordination, update, and implementation of the state hazard mitigation plan. And we are required at the state level, and all state plans in the nation are required to show how we're integrating with other planning initiatives. So we show how we're taking the concept of mitigation and integrating with other things like climate adaptation and the climate mitigation strategies to help build overall a more resilient state and more resilient communities. So I can confirm at the state level that that's true.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan. Jesse, you might have been on mute, or maybe you had to leave the webinar. I'm going to give you one last second to see if you're there to answer. Okay.
Becky, this is Victoria. I can actually confirm. We have a set of required elements for the local hazard mitigation plan that is a national FEMA standard, and that is a requirement for all states.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, hopefully that helps some folks out there. We don't have any other questions at this point in our question box, so we're going to carry on to question number 3. So we'll pull up the poll and get that started for you. The question is, how can stakeholder engagement and resilience planning be improved? Okay, we're getting close to seeing nearly all of you respond. Okay, we're holding steady. Okay, the answer is A, include engagement in the budget to foster community support. Really, include engagement in the budget at the appropriate level that's going to support what's needed in order to gain community buy-in. I can understand why folks would select B. There were a few folks that did so. Better late than never. Sure, yeah, better late than never. But let's aim higher. So I'm going to turn over to Mary Small.
Okay, thanks, Becky. So I'm Mary Small with the State Coastal Conservancy, and I think this is one of the really big ideas that came through all of the work that the agencies did in talking about aligning these plans, that it really creates an opportunity by aligning the plans, you can potentially expand the community of stakeholders that you are involving and get better plans and get better buy-in. But in order to do that successfully, you really need to think about and plan for, and as Becky said, budget for meaningful public engagement at the outset. There are tons of good resources and tools about public engagement and guides to help you consider equity and environmental justice issues as you develop your approach. I'm happy to follow up with sending people links, but Google works pretty well too. I mean, there's a lot on this. But has already been mentioned by some of the other speakers, the equity perspective is especially critical to incorporate into climate vulnerability assessments, because vulnerabilities are going to be amplified by structural inequity. So think about moving beyond just informing the public, but rather towards involving, collaborating, or empowering the community to help you develop your plan, use their expertise to identify the risks and prioritize the actions, and be really creative in designing engagement and tapping into existing community events and structures. And so that's sort of our high-level message, and I'll turn it over to Leeanne.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit kind of at the big picture level from the local perspective on how we have engaged the community to buy in on some of these strategies, and then dive into some more of the nuts and bolts. So for us, really, we started with the general plan vision. We spent about a year talking about our general plan vision, about what we wanted, what we valued as a community, and how that could be manifested in kind of the actual physical development of our community over the next 30, 50 years. And so by looking at both resilience and adaptation through the lens of our core community values, it really helped to align our policies with other initiatives and identify solutions that achieve multiple objectives. So if coastal hazards and flooding is of concern, but we also know that our community is really focused about water quality and pedestrian safety, figuring out how we incorporate strategies that help reduce the risk of coastal flooding while also improving water quality and pedestrian safety through our transportation projects, we can kind of leverage and build greater community support for implementation of our resilience strategies by articulating kind of the co-benefits of those. For us, we looked kind of on a more tangible scale. We did a couple of our traditional community workshops during this process, but once we got to a certain phase where we were asking people their thoughts on policy, we switched from a traditional workshop format to doing walking tours on different topics. And a key one of those walking tours that we did, where we brought in technical experts and community stakeholders, was to talk about coastal access and sea level rise and what are some of those potential options, so that people could be in the environment as they're talking about the potential risks and also the potential solutions. In terms of diving into some more of the nuts and bolts, as planners or as technical experts, sometimes we can get lost in the details of what we're doing. We have a high degree of understanding of the concepts, but for the community really to help improve their engagement in a process so that they can also then help support the strategies. There were a couple of lessons learned from our perspective on simplifying understanding, right? Using plain language, avoiding jargon, avoiding overuse of acronyms. Everyone's got their own alphabet soup of different acronyms that get used everywhere. Relying on things like frequently asked questions were all key things that we had to rely on during our process to avoid things being misconstrued or misrepresented, really kind of putting people back to what's the goal here, how do we articulate it in a way that can have broad community understanding, and then maximizing consistency. So for us, it was kind of one of the things that we didn't do that I have since learned and always like to share with communities that are embarking on this process now. Maximizing consistency across different plans is really important. We've had a number of, whether it's our general plan and technical studies or environmental documents for smaller projects here in town, or it's different data sources, using the same terminology, units of measurement, data methods, data sources to the extent possible is really key. And the kind of lesson learned here is that we had some studies that would reference 55 inches worth of sea level rise expected by the year 2100. And we had other studies that talked about 5 feet of sea level rise and others that mentioned 150 centimeters. And so when it came down to it, that's not easy for a lot of folks. They're all virtually the same level of projection of sea level rise, but we would end up with folks coming in and saying, I hear we're going to have, 150 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Not really what we're planning for, but you can see how using different terminology or different units of measurement can for the public that doesn't deal with this on a day-to-day basis, become very confusing. And then the last point I'll make here, for us, a really important component of getting community participation in this was the storytelling aspect. So maps, they're very important tools for technical folks, for policymakers, but they're not always approachable to the general public. And so for us, we really use the maps as a kind of a base, but we help to tell the story and build support for our policies by showing images, visualizations of what sea level rise might look like in the future and what some of the solutions might look like, and then adding in numbers that people can relate to. So for us, we talk about, showing a map of potential sea level rise inundation was not nearly as impactful as saying that we could see a 300% increase in our flooded areas, or that we have 200 buildings and 1,000 residences that might be potentially impacted by the effects of sea level rise by 2100. And that becomes more tangible and more relatable to the community. And so we really tried to focus on that through our planning processes.
Thank you, Leeanne. And that's actually the perfect transition to our final trivia question. As long as there's no questions in the box, and I don't believe there are. So our final trivia question for you to consider is, which climate and sea level rise scenarios should be used during the planning process? All right. Wow, this was a fast one. We got nearly all of you. Just a few more coming in here at the end, and see if there's anybody else want to place a last second vote. Okay. So interestingly, nobody said A. We had about a third of you say different scenarios in each plan, depending on the purpose of the plan. And just about 70% of you did select what we believe is the correct answer, which is the same scenarios across all plans based on best available science. And I'm going to turn to Juliette. I know she has something to say on this topic.
Thanks, Becky. Well, I think that's really interesting that no one picked the first one, actually. So I'm going off script for a second, because maybe about 5 years ago when we did the second round of the Coastal Adaptation Needs Assessment Survey, I think that the inclination would have been to have answer A be the one that people say. It was whatever they could get through. So it's really promising to see that people are seeing the value of using the same scenarios. And all of us on this panel, especially those of us out there talking about the science, I mean, this is the most common question that we get when we're working with communities. I think the perception is that there's a ton of information out there and it's all conflicting, and what do you do? And that's actually not necessarily the case. Thankfully, again, the state has stepped in and done a ton of work in trying to identify and develop guidance on how to help coastal communities look at the information that's available. And so on the screen right now, you're seeing the California Ocean Protection Council Sea Level Rise Guidance. And that was a document that came out, I think, maybe a year and a half ago now, that was developed by scientists and policymakers, and it provides the guidance on how to choose which sea level rise scenario to use. They provide a suite of probabilistic projections and kind of base it in your risk tolerance, and then give some guidance on what would be the best way to choose your risk tolerance and how to go about planning. And so this guidance is meant to be sort of the authoritative source that at least all the state agencies are turning towards, and now more and more local jurisdictions are looking to this to get to their scenarios. So both, there's been, I think, a shift in how people are thinking about this, but there's also now these resources that can guide people to the right numbers. Kelsey will talk after me, and she can talk a little bit more about how the Coastal Commission uses this. But in general, I think the main point that we make in the Compass is is, as you can, is to try to use the same scenarios across all the different plans, from the local coastal program to a plan that you wouldn't necessarily think about using sea level rise scenarios like the local hazard mitigation plan. In one example, the city of LA has been doing their local coastal program at the same time as their local hazard mitigation plan. And so because they were able to set up a standing team that was between both sides of the aisle, if you will, the planning group and then the emergency usual kind of suspects building out the emergency management plans, there was a lot of communication between them. And so they were able to use the same sea level rise scenarios. Leeanne started us off today talking about how the work that they did and the vulnerability assessment for the sea level rise work in Hermosa was able to be used to guide all the other plans. So the second most common question that those of us talking about the science get is, yeah, but the science is always changing. And it is and it isn't, right? The science is evolving. That's the nature of how science evolves and works. We're always sort of asking the same question, trying to make sure we can get the same answer or a more clarified answer, just getting more and more precision as we go along, or accuracy as we go along. And so the question isn't so much about, the science isn't necessarily changing in the absolute numbers, it's more on when things may happen. So this is why you'll see a lot of information in the Compass about using a more adaptive management approach, where you're sort of moving away from absolute numbers, but making decisions based on triggers. So this allows you to have a plan in place where you sort of put a policy in place based on a certain amount of sea level rise or a certain amount of beach erosion. And when that trigger happens, then you move to your next phase of planning. So this helps you sort of take away some of the fear around, well, what if we pick this number and it doesn't happen by this date? And, do we have to completely redo our plan? And ideally, if you have this plan in place, let's say we all do our part on and do our appropriate greenhouse gas mitigation, maybe we can slow things a little bit and we have a little bit longer time to get to the plans get to the policies that we have in place. The third most common question that we usually get along this kind of which science and, where do you get the information is, which model do I use? And so this other here on the slide, you see a little teaser for a resource that's going to become available pretty soon called See the Future, which, if those of you are familiar with Lifting the Fog, which was really the effort that brought this whole group sort of together about 5 years ago. See the Future is the latest iteration of it, where we take some work that was done to help identify the different models and what kind of is under the hood of all of those. The See the Future tool will now make that more accessible and help communities to kind of access all the different tools, understand what they all do, and help sort of narrow down to which information you should be using. But really the short answer to this is that use all the information that's at your disposal. We are blessed here to have a ton of really good science and information. And so when you can use Cosmos and NOAA and the consultant-based modeling and all the information that's out there, you're only going to get a more robust answer. So there's guidance in place by the state to help you figure out which sea level scenarios you want to use. There's the recommendation to think about it in an adaptive approach so that you're not bound to a certain date, but you can be responsive to the triggers that you've set in place. And then the third point of it is just being open to using all the information, acknowledging that some of it may not overlap, but where they do, that is a for sure indication of where you want to be focusing your planning, and sort of embrace that uncertainty and know that all of that is giving you a more robust answer. That's where I'll stop.
And I will pick up there. This is Kelsey again from the Coastal Commission. And in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of quickly run through a couple main ideas, but we do have a lot more detail in the Coastal Commission sea level rise guidance about using the scenarios that are in the OPC state sea level rise guidance and what those mean. But like I said, a few big ideas. One thing is that ideally the planning horizons that you're looking at in these different kind of vulnerability assessments should account for the anticipated lifetime of different types of development. So houses, for example, are in place longer than just a 30-year mortgage, and things like wastewater treatment plants, bridges, other types of critical infrastructure can be around for 100 years or more. So those planning efforts should really consider what that future looks like and assess hazards over those time periods. So thinking about those higher amounts of sea level rise, including some of the more worst case scenarios, that you're really getting a picture of those hazards. At the same time, you don't want to just look at that end point and then design and build to that exact amount of sea level rise and kind of hope for the best, but rather think about how impacts and risks are going to change over time. So science and institutions are always evolving, and one way I think this is playing out right now is that we're all considering these sort of phased adaptation approaches as an option for dealing with changing hazards. And actually how to implement those kinds of phased adaptation approaches. So like I said, it's not always feasible or even ideal to design for the conditions that we're going to see in the year 2100 when you're doing something tomorrow, for example. But studying a range of sea level rise scenarios and thinking about those triggers like Juliette was talking about can help us assess when different adaptation approaches are going to be needed and how we can phase that in over time in a way that actually makes sense and is feasible from any number of standpoints. And then I just really wanted to add as a last thing that planning really shouldn't consider just vulnerabilities for built assets. I know that's a huge topic, and something that we're really concerned about is how will this, how will sea level rise impact our houses and our community centers and that kind of thing. But we want to think about those different scenarios, sea level rise and how they interact with natural and social systems, and then how adaptation strategies we choose to implement will affect these same systems. So what does it mean, for example, to a community if a beach is lost because we've chosen to protect a row of homes in place? And at the same time, how can we ensure that adaptation strategies don't displace low-income populations or affect people's ability to get to and from their homes? So really thinking about all those different kinds of social, natural, built asset kind of vulnerabilities as you're doing these different kind of planning efforts is really important. And the scenarios you use in these planning efforts should reflect that. I think with that, we'll turn it over to questions. Is that right, Becky?
That's right.
That's right. Yep. So we have time for some questions here from the crowd. Now's a good time to get those into our questions box if you have them for us. We have a few minutes to do a couple questions, hopefully. We do have one question here that I think could be directed to Nuin-Tara. Are there recommended open sources for data at the state level related to climate and resilience? And then if there's someone else who wants to jump in on that, we have a little bit of time for that too.
Yeah, this is Nuin-Tara. I'll start, and then anyone else please add in. I think one of the key resources that I would highlight here in California that we're very lucky to have is CalAdapt. And CalAdapt, which is cal-adapt.org, provides downscaled climate projection data across a number of different climate impacts for the state of California, including sea level rise data, but also other climate impacts like extreme heat, wildfire, precipitation, and other visualization tools that allow you to see the changing impacts of climate across the state. We do have other links to other open, publicly accessible data sources that are out there. A number of them were talked about here today through our Adaptation Clearinghouse, which is resilient with a T, ca.org, and if you go to the tools and data page, you can access, see a whole number of different publicly accessible data that's available in California.
Does anybody else want to jump in? This is Becky speaking, and it's actually the perfect place for me to mention that there's another part of the compass that helps answer the question of where the various state guidance documents, tools, and models specifically related to sea level rise and flooding fit into the steps of the planning process. And so one place that you could look for some of these other data sources is the back end of the compass tool. And in a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit more about how you can access that. But does anybody else want to respond to this question, or are we covered?
I think we'll move on. We have one more question here, and that'll probably wrap it up for the amount of time we have for questions today. This one can go to the group, so any of our panelists feel free to jump in on this. Are there any communities in California developing ways to inhibit building in vulnerable areas, especially regarding public infrastructure?
This is Kelsey from the Coastal Commission. I can, start. I guess a short answer is yes. As local coastal programs are updated, one of the things we're starting to see is, we've always kind of seen these kinds of things. So there are lots of policies that we've seen in LCPs that reflect the Coastal Act about siting and design standards. The Coastal Act says that development should be built in such a way that it's safe over its anticipated lifetime without the requirements of shoreline armoring. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But so that's always kind of played out with things like setbacks and avoiding flood areas. And so we're seeing more of that and more specific policies that call out sea level rise as a specific kind of hazard to address. So, we're thinking about flooding and erosion, not just the current impacts of those, but what is it going to be over the entire lifetime of development. So there are land use policies in updated LCPs and even some older ones that are specific towards not allowing or at least minimizing development in particularly vulnerable areas.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have time for one more quick question here that we've got. The question is, does the state of California utilize the Cosmos model? That could probably go to Juliette, if that works for you, Juliette.
I think so. It depends on who you're asking. So the Cosmos model, that's obviously the model that the team that I work with at USGS developed. So it's being used a lot wherever it's available. So it's currently available from the U.S.-Mexico border up almost through to the Golden Gate. We've got one little stretch within the Central Coast that is still being developed for Santa Cruz and Monterey, and then we're starting the North Coast. But yeah, it's been used by, I think, a lot of the local coastal program, sea level rise vulnerability assessments have used them. It's been used in several of the local hazard mitigation, the most recent ones that have been coming. I mentioned the city of LA. I'm blanking right now on a couple of the others. And so it's getting very widely used, and it has been it's predominantly funded half by the USGS and half by various state agencies. Thank you all very much, Ocean Protection Council and Resources Agency and Coastal Conservancy. So it really has been developed to be used for these types of planning processes. So I think that was what the question was asking.
Great, thank you. So we do have a couple more questions that we will follow up with offline just because of our time constraints, but thank you all for putting those in to us. We'll make sure that we're following up with each of them. I'm gonna move along. I'm gonna give it over to Becky for some quick closing comments.
Thank you. So a few final things. Plan alignment is a topic page at the state's Adaptation Clearinghouse at resilientcalifornia.org, and that's where you'll find an online interactive version of the Compass tool, so go check that out. We also have some glossy hard copy flip books that are pretty sweet. If you'd like a hard copy, you can contact any one of the folks on the panel. All of our agencies have boxes of the flip books to distribute, and we'd be happy to send you any number that you need. And lastly, we're going to be at the California APA conference in mid-September. So you can come and see the panel live. Our trivia there will have prizes, and you can find us to chat personally. So if you're planning to be at the APA conference, we'd love to chat with you. So a final thank you to Dan, and I'm going to turn it back to you to close us out.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to thank Becky for organizing today's webinar and getting all the panelists together. And thank you to all our panelists as well. And attendees, it's great. We've had a lot of interaction with you today. We'll follow up with those questions afterwards, and you will see a recording and the slides within the next couple days in your email. So you can look out for those. So thanks for listening in. We hope to hear from you some more. And with that, we'll close off and say, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.